Manchester, December 2024. A landlord named David Harrison owned 14 rental properties across the city. He'd been in the game for 22 years. Built his portfolio through the 2008 crash, survived Brexit, weathered COVID. Last month, he listed all 14 properties for sale within a single week. When a local journalist asked him why, he said something that should terrify every property investor in the UK. The math doesn't work anymore. And it's not coming back. He's not alone. Across 5 specific cities in the UK, landlords are exiting at rates we haven't seen since the early 1990s. But here's what makes this different. They're not panicking. They're not dumping properties at fire sale prices. They're quietly, methodically selling. And the data tells us exactly why, exactly where, and exactly what happens next. If you're a landlord, a tenant, or someone thinking about buying property in the UK, the next 15 minutes will change how you see the 2026 housing market. Because what's happening in these 5 cities isn't just a local correction. It's a structural shift that's about to reshape the entire British property landscape. Let's start with the numbers that nobody's talking about. Between January 2024 and November 2024, landlord property listings increased by 38 in 5 specific UK cities. That's not a gradual trend. That's a controlled evacuation. But to understand why this is happening now, you need to understand what changed in April 2024. The UK government introduced 3 policy changes simultaneously. First, mortgage interest relief was capped at 20 for landlords. Second, capital gains tax on property sales increased from 18 to 24 for higher-rate taxpayers. Third, and this is the one most people missed, Section 24 restrictions fully phased in, meaning landlords can no longer deduct mortgage interest from rental income before calculating taxes. Here's what that looks like in real money. A landlord with a £300,000 property, charging £1,500 per month in rent, with a £200,000 mortgage at 5 interest, used to make a pre-tax profit of around £8,000 per year. After April 2024, that same landlord is now paying tax on £18,000 of income, not £8,000. Their actual profit after tax? Around £2,100. That's a 74% reduction in net income. Now add in the new landlord licensing schemes, expanded tenant protections under the Renters Reform Bill, and the fact that eviction processes now take an average of 9 months in England, and you start to see the calculation every landlord is running. It's not that property is a bad investment. It's that being a residential landlord in the UK has become a low-margin, high-risk, heavily regulated business that requires professional management. The casual landlord, the person with 2 or 3 buy-to-lets as pension supplements, is being systematically priced out. And that brings us to the 5 cities where this is happening fastest. City number 1, Manchester. The data here is striking. According to Rightmove and Zoopla listings data, landlord sale listings in Greater Manchester increased by 42 between January and October 2024. But the more interesting number is this. The average time a rental property stays on the market before selling has dropped from 67 days in 2023 to 41 days in 2024. That tells you something crucial. Landlords aren't struggling to sell. They're choosing to sell, and buyers are ready. The question is, who's buying? The answer, property funds, institutional investors, and cash buyers from London repositioning into northern cities. They're not buying to rent. They're buying to hold and develop, or they're buying because Manchester property is still cheap relative to southern England. But here's the problem for tenants. When a small landlord sells to an institutional buyer, the property often gets renovated and relisted at 20 to 30 higher rent. We're seeing this pattern repeat in Salford, Trafford, and Stockport. The exit of small landlords isn't lowering rents. It's consolidating the market into the hands of larger players who have economies of scale, legal teams, and higher rent targets. City number 2, Birmingham. This one surprised researchers because Birmingham has been considered a landlord-friendly market for decades. But between April and November 2024, rental property sales in Birmingham increased by 36. The specific areas seeing the heaviest exits are Edgbaston, Harborne, and Selly Oak, which are traditionally student and young professional rental zones. Why Birmingham? 2 reasons. First, Birmingham City Council is rolling out one of the most aggressive landlord licensing schemes in the UK. As of 2024, Nearly every rental property in Birmingham requires a license, costing between £500 and £1,000 per property, renewable every 5 years. For a landlord with a small portfolio, that's a significant new cost with no revenue benefit. Second, and this is critical, Birmingham's rental yields have been falling. In 2020, the average rental yield in Birmingham was around 5.8. In 2024, it's closer to 4.1. Meanwhile, mortgage rates for buy-to-let properties are sitting between 5 and 6. You're now in a situation where the cost of borrowing is higher than the income yield. That's called negative carry, and it's unsustainable unless you're banking on capital appreciation. But with property prices in Birmingham relatively flat over the last 18 months, that bet isn't paying off. City number 3, Leeds. This is where the story gets more complicated because Leeds is actually seeing population growth, strong employment numbers, and rising wages. But landlord exits in Leeds have increased by 33 year-on-year. Why? The answer is tenant regulation. Leeds City Council has been at the forefront of tenant protection policies, including rent stabilization discussions, mandatory property inspections, and stricter penalties for noncompliance. For landlords operating on thin margins, the regulatory burden is the breaking point. It's not that they can't make money. It's that the time, stress, and legal risk are no longer worth the return. And here's the data point that should concern policymakers. Rental supply in Leeds is now falling faster than tenant demand is declining. According to the latest figures from Zoopla, rental listings in Leeds are down 18 compared to last year, while tenant inquiries are down only 9. That gap is widening. What that means in practice is that rents are rising even as landlords exit. In the last 6 months, average rents in Leeds have increased by 11, one of the highest growth rates in the UK. City number 4, Liverpool. Liverpool's landlord exit rate is 29, slightly lower than the other cities, but still significant. What makes Liverpool different is the type of landlord leaving. Liverpool has a large number of small-scale landlords who bought properties during the 2010s when prices were low and rental yields were high. Many of these landlords are now in their 50s and 60s, and they're choosing to exit while the market is still relatively strong. But there's another factor. Liverpool's property market has been heavily influenced by new build developments and housing association projects. The supply of rental properties has increased, but so has tenant choice. Landlords are finding it harder to maintain occupancy rates, especially for older properties that don't meet modern energy efficiency standards. Under new regulations, rental properties must meet a minimum EPC rating of C by 2025. For older Victorian and Edwardian properties in Liverpool, achieving that standard can cost £10,000 to £15,000 per property. Many landlords are simply choosing to sell rather than invest. City number 5, Bristol. This is the most surprising entry on the list because Bristol has been one of the UK's strongest property markets over the last decade. But landlord sales in Bristol have increased by 31 in 2024. The reason? Bristol is expensive, and the math for landlords has completely broken. The average house price in Bristol is now over £350,000. For a landlord buying today, even with a 25 deposit, the mortgage payments at 5.5 interest are around £1,600 per month. The average rent for a 2-bedroom property in Bristol is £1,400. After maintenance, insurance, letting agent fees, and taxes, landlords are operating at a loss. The only way it works is if property prices continue rising at 5 or more per year. But prices in Bristol have been flat since mid-2023. So landlords who bought 5 or 10 years ago are cashing out while they still have equity. The problem is that new buyers can't make the numbers work either, so properties are increasingly being purchased by cash buyers, often as personal residences or second homes, not rentals. That's reducing rental supply in an already tight market. And it's one of the reasons Bristol now has some of the highest rent-to-income ratios in the UK outside of London. Now here's the question everyone should be asking. If landlords are selling, why aren't prices falling? Because in a normal market, increased supply should lower prices. But that's not happening. Why? 3 reasons. First, institutional buyers are absorbing much of the supply. Property funds, pension funds, and large-scale build-to-rent operators are buying portfolios directly from exiting landlords. These transactions often happen off-market, so they don't show up in public listings. Second, first-time buyers and residential buyers are competing for the same properties, especially in cities like Manchester and Birmingham, where prices are still relatively affordable compared to the South. Third, and this is critical, the UK has a structural housing shortage. Even with landlords selling, there simply aren't enough homes to meet demand. But here's what's about to change. Right now, landlords are selling into a relatively stable market. Buyers exist. Prices are holding. But watch what happens if mortgage rates stay elevated into 2025 and 2026. The buyers dry up. Properties sit longer. Prices start to soften. And then you get the second wave of landlord exits, the ones who were holding on, hoping the market would turn. That's when the correction accelerates. So what does this mean for you? If you're a tenant in one of these 5 cities, expect rents to keep rising in the short term. Reduced supply and increased demand equals higher prices. If you're a landlord, you need to run the numbers now. If your net yield after tax and expenses is below 3, you're essentially running a break-even operation with significant risk. If you're thinking about buying rental property in these cities, the question you need to ask is not whether you can afford the mortgage. It's whether you can sustain losses for 2 to 3 years while waiting for capital appreciation that might not come. And if you're a policymaker, this data should be a warning. The UK government's stated goal is to improve tenant protections and increase housing supply. But the unintended consequence of these policies is that small landlords, who provide a significant portion of the UK's rental housing, are exiting the market. The supply isn't being replaced by new builds fast enough. And the rental market is consolidating into the hands of large institutional players who operate differently, charge more, and respond to market incentives in ways that don't always benefit tenants. David Harrison, the Manchester landlord who sold all 14 properties, said something else in that interview. He said, "I'm not bitter. I made money. But the game changed, and I'm too old to learn new rules." He's right. The game has changed. The question is whether the people still playing understand the new rules, or whether they're about to learn the hard way. If this video helped you understand what's really happening in the UK property market, share it with someone who needs to see it. And if you want more data-driven analysis on the UK economy, housing, and the forces shaping your financial future, subscribe. Because what's happening in these 5 cities is just the beginning. The UK housing market is entering a phase that will define the next decade. And the decisions you make in the next 12 months, whether you're a landlord, tenant, or buyer, will determine whether you're positioned correctly for what comes next. Thanks for watching.